Okay, just clarifying my chat with physicist Jack Sarfatti. I want to thank Jeremy Reese for inviting me to question Jack Sarfatti about noncommutativity. And um, he has corresponded with Basil J. Hiley previously, who I referred to as the main source for noncommutativity in physics. And so Jack referred to Clifford algebra, um, which is true that Basil J. Hiley relies on Clifford algebra. Um, but Basil J. Hiley's big point is that the big problem in physics now is that physicists are taking classical physics and trying to apply it to quantum physics, when in fact that's the wrong foundation of reality and it should be the other way around. And so when Jack says we don't need non-commutativity, what he's implying is that we can ignore the non-commutative foundation of reality that's explained by the Clifford algebra, because the non-commutativity gives a rise to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of position and momentum that Jack referred to. And as I had said, I understand what he's talking about, but Basil J. Hiley is explaining that there is a deeper level of non-commutative phase space that's before configuration space. And so Jack referred to space-time, and I said, no, this is pre-space, because that's what Basil J. Hiley's talking about. And so that made me realize that Jack did not understand Basil J. Hiley's latest research, which is focused on non-commutativity as pre-space. And so therefore, every particle in the configuration space of Hilbert space has two positions. And those two positions are actually based on the future and the past overlapping in time. And so Basil J. Hiley's big point is that because Dirac did not analyze the Planck's constant in reduced form, what's called h bar, to the order of the limit of h bar squared. Therefore, Dirac tried to dismiss the non-commutativity as violating the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And so then Richard Feynman just carried on the same problem of Dirac as Basil J. Hiley explains, and he goes into the details in that about Richard Feynman's error. And so so Basil J. Hiley says when you use Planck's constant squared and anything beyond that, then you get the quantum potential, which is the Bohmian quantum potential that exists due to non-commutativity of time and frequency. So it originates from the Heisenberg transition frequencies that Heisenberg first discovered when he was analyzing the Ritz-Rydberg combination principle in spectroscopy. And this is also the focus of non-commutative physicist Alain Kahn, discussing the transition frequencies of the Ritz-Rydberg combination principle being non-commutative. And so then um, Basil J. Hiley's other big point is that in quantum biology, it is assumed that the collapse of the wave function then cancels out any quantum effects on the macro scale. So this again alludes to Jack's claim that we can just approach things from a classical macro scale and then pump energy into the quantum micro scale. But Basil J. Hiley is saying the exact opposite, that not only do we not need the quantum wave function, but since we don't need it, therefore it does not collapse. And what we do instead is we maintain non-commutativity into the macro scale. And this is what enables anti-gravity in terms of quantum biology. And so early in my discussion with Jack, I referred to a weak measurement experiment of Aronhoff, Yakir Aronhoff, that actually mentioned that this demonstrated a gravitationally repulsive force. And so Jack was very excited by that quote because that demonstrates true anti-gravity, but it does so in terms of non-commutativity. And this is Basil J. Hiley's big point, is that the weak measurements experiments, which are using entangled photons, actually are they're only enabled by Bohmian, the quantum potential being non-commutative, and that Yakir Aronhoff doesn't understand that about the weak measurement experiments that he's doing. And so Basil J. Hiley is also doing weak measurement experiments with argon and helium, and that will prove the non-commutativity because you're using mass instead of just a photon. And so that's basically it. The other thing is my own teacher that I trained with to finish my master's degree. I mentioned in my talk with Jack Sarfatti, the Taoist yoga master who is a Qigong medical healer, Qigong master, spiritual healer. He did achieve levitation when he finished his 28-day cave meditation in Mount Qingcheng, China. In the cave there, he was in full lotus, Padma asana, meditation nonstop for 28 days with no sleep. And so when he finished that, then he achieved, when he left the cave, then he was in full lotus meditation again, and he achieved anti-gravity on the macro scale by levitating up 9 feet. And so Jack says he acknowledges that this is possible. In one of his recent papers discusses Saint Joseph de Cupertino, who was a Western Christian mystic saint who also levitated on a routine basis when he experienced the greatest joy in his heart. That's when he would levitate. And he was well documented to levitate because the church did not like the fact that he levitated. And so there were a lot of complaints against him. And so that I got a hair in my throat. Sorry. So the Professor Michael Grosso has documented the case of Saint Joseph de Cupertino in a couple books, and the man who could fly is the the book that goes over Saint Joseph de Cupertino, but Michael Grosso also had a biography of Saint Joseph de Cupertino translated into English from Italian. What's the name of that one? Anyway, so essentially I mentioned Eddie Oceans, who worked at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and he was hired to work on noncommutativity as the solution of what he calls quantum psychology. And so Eddie Oceans also taught Wing Chun, which is the martial arts of Bruce Lee, and Oceans argued that the secret of Neigong, which is internal martial arts, is due to non-commutativity. And Eddie Oceans collaborated with math professor Lou Kaufman, who also focuses on non-commutativity. And so I've corresponded with math professor Lou Kaufman several times about non-commutativity, because Eddie Oceans, he passed on early, but his legacy is continued in the sense that I've been promoting his work, but he still has a website up, but there's not any links from his website to other websites, and so there's not much discussion of his work online. But he did prominent research, and he was promoted and supported by the physicists at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and he himself was trained in physics and also focused on what he called quantum psychology, but also on the mind-matter unification. So this corroborates Basil J. Hiley's claim that the quantum biology does not need to be limited by the collapse of the wave function due to non-commutativity, because that's exactly what Eddie Oceans was claiming also. And so you have, when you consider also the point of B.G. Siddharth, who's a physics professor in India, and he first predicted the acceleration of the universe due to dark energy. And he also focuses on non-commutativity. And his point is that the mass of the photon is due to non-commutative space-time. So if you also consider Nobel physicist Gerard de Hooft, who wrote a paper called Light is Heavy, that he co-authored with Martin van der Mark, and they focus on Louis de Broglie and the law of phase harmony. And Louis de Broglie was one of the founders of quantum physics, and he was critiquing relativity at the time when he discovered his law of phase harmony, which is what David Bohm rediscovered as the quantum potential. So Louis de Broglie, he was calling it the pilot wave, but the problem is that when you use the word wave, it assumes there's some kind of space-time continuum. But the quantum potential, as Basil J. Hiley emphasizes, exists in pre-space as just a direct time. So before you make any measurement, when you're at zero time, there's already this future time overlapping with the past time, and as these two positions of time and frequency. So it's in a frequency time configuration, or it's not even a configuration, it's just a non-local dynamic. or process, but that's pre-space. And so this is what B.G. Siddharth also figured out. So the focus of Gerard de Hooft is that all matter is actually made of photons. And so when you realize that all matter is made of photons, and then the photon has the non-commutative mass as anti-gravity from this momentum and and wavelength that's originally negative entropy due to the time and frequency. So you have a negative frequency that's actually a time reversed information. That's a newly discovered anti-gravity force. And so this is the foundation of reality. That's also what Roger Penrose calls proto-consciousness as gravitational negative entropy. And so the reason I brought up the abrupt global warming crisis is that Roger Penrose points out that gravitational entropy is the opposite of the entropy of matter. And so when you realize that all matter is actually made of light, of the photons, then when we try to decrease the entropy of matter using technology based on commutative geometry, we're actually increasing gravitational entropy on Earth as the ecological crisis. And so Roger Penrose, he says, well, Earth probably will not survive global warming. He agrees. And so Alon Khan, Roger Penrose, he cites Alon Khan. Penrose also relies on noncommutativity as the foundation of reality. And so Alon Khan, the Fields Medal math professor, who's considered like the father of non-commutative geometry, he focuses on this time frequency foundation of reality, and he says that's how our brains work, is that we create linear time. Our sense of linear time is created from this earlier, what he calls primitive time, that's not linear. It's the future and the past overlapping, just as Basil J. Hiley explains. And so this is also the basis of negative entropy. Again, as Alon Khan, he gives a lecture to physicists about this. And so Basil J. Hiley says that Alon Khan's lecture is very important for physicists, and I discussed this. I sent the lecture to Basil J. Hiley, and he thanked me and agreed that was very, very important. And he cites Alon Khan's research as well when Basil J. Hiley has published on time. Basically, so you have two times. You have the future and the past, and they're going in the opposite directions. They're overlapping. And so, as Roger Penrose explains, on a biological level, when you access this proto-consciousness that's non-local, then you're able to have precognitive information. And it's that precognitive information that was what Louis de Broglie called the pilot wave, and what David Bohm calls the quantum potential. So you have this novel information force that's anti-gravity, that's also precognitive and guiding us from the future. And so this is where physics professor Paul S. Wesson, when he, in his final years of his model of the universe as a fifth dimensional black hole, he rediscovered Louis de Broglie's law of phase harmony and published on that. And he said that this is the truth of reality. And so you have all matter, again, is made of light, and so it's all connected in the fifth dimension at the speed of light, and you have this superluminal energy information, or it's a force. It's a new type of force. It's before any classical energy. And so Paul S. Wesson said this explains spiritual phenomenon, all types of spiritual phenomenon. So he said, if you're interested in spiritual phenomenon, this would coexist with science. And due to this fifth dimensional black hole, and this is what Gerard de Hoof calls the eternal black hole, that's the source of all matter. So it's a different kind of black hole than what Stephen Hawking originally analyzed as a black hole. And so Gerard de Hoof, who's a Nobel physicist, and he had a bit of a spat on a live stream with Nobel physicist Roger Penrose, discussing the eternal black hole concept of Gerard de Hoof. And essentially Penrose and de Hoof, they agree. It's just they use different kind of mathematics. And so, but in the exchange between Penrose and Hiley, Hiley again emphasized to Penrose that we don't have to bother with this problem of the collapse of the wave function that then has to turn to gravity as the causing the collapse of the wave function, because if we realize that space-time is emergent from the non-commutativity, we can then maintain the non-commutativity into the macro scale as the basis of negentropy for quantum biology. And of course, both Penrose was referring to Erwin Schrödinger's 1945 book and called What is Life, that was the first to argue that life originates from the same source of the sun. The power of the sun is not actually from the fusion originally, it's from the quantum or the gravitational potential energy, as Penrose explains, that originates from this quantum negative entropy, quantum negentropy. As dark energy, he says that's what is typically called dark energy, but it's actually this gravitational potential energy from the quantum potential as negentropy. And so as Alain points out, all of science thus far has been based on commutative geometry, not non-commutative geometry. And Alain says that that most scientists consider non-commutative geometry to be a nuisance and very strange. And this is what even Roger Penrose says. He says he's not very good at non-commutative mathematics, even though he's a math professor, and that he finds it a nuisance. The non-commutative geometry is a nuisance. But Alain argues that this is the hard fact of reality, that non-commutativity, we are forced to accept the logical truth of non-commutativity as the true foundation of reality. And this is also math professor Luke Hoffman's point, that his research on non-commutativity is that the square root of -1 as the imaginary number actually arises from a asymmetric time shift iterant of algebra. So you have what he calls it primordial time. So again, you have this pre-space dynamic that is just an algebraic process of information. And Luke Hoffman says it's almost mystical. You could call it mystical if you wanted. And So, so Basil J. Hiley's claim, along with Eddie Ocean's, when Eddie Ocean's worked at SLAC, is that if you maintain the noncommutativity, it will self-amplify into the macro scale. Now, Pascual Jordan was actually the first to make that claim in the 1930s, and he was the one who developed the noncommutativity math for Heisenberg originally at the request of Max Born. I think it was who's the other guy? I always forget his name. He's the guy who, like Jack Sarfatti, he he liked to make quips that were like demeaning quips about his other physicists in a friendly manner, supposedly. But Pauli, yeah, it's Pauli, Wolfgang Pauli. Okay, so Jack Sarfatti actually met Heisenberg. That's why I asked him if he had actually met Pascual Jordan. And the problem with Pascual Jordan, of course, is that he was an ardent racist, Nazi, fascist, and of course, we've seen a rise of that heinous ideology due to just the inherent problems of commutative geometry. That's what I would argue, is that when you have the wrong foundation of reality in commutative geometry, then you get these logical errors that it's so Pascual Jordan, even though he had that insight into non-commutativity, he couldn't escape the larger problem of Western science as it has been constructed thus far. But if we look at the non-Western pre-Socratic cultures like Parmenides, Empedocles, Anaximander, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, these are the pre-Socratics that relied on non-commutativity, along with Taoism and the three gunas of India. That's another non-commutative philosophy, and it actually is explained by simple non-Western music theory that Alain Kahn calls 2, 3, and infinity in his lecture, The Music of Shapes. And it's only Fields Medal physicist or Fields Medal math professor Alain Kahn, who realized the secret of music theory. The truth of music theory is actually non-commutative. And the simplest non-commutative equation of reality is what he just calls 2, 3, and infinity. Now, this is the same precise secret that I had figured out when I was studying music privately from age like 3 to 5. I started music training, and then I kept at it, and I studied with a private former university music professor, and my piano teacher taught music theory, and so I studied intensively into advanced music training when I was a teenager. And so I had realized this non-commutative secret of music. And then when I took quantum physics, my first year of college at Hampshire College, taught by the former student colleague of Jack Sarfatti, Herbert J. Bernstein. Bernstein taught us that everybody should take quantum physics as their very first physics course, or else they learn the wrong foundation of reality. And so this is, again, also Basil J. Hiley's focus. For example, the but Bernstein, he also focused on Bohmian physics, and Basil J. Hiley, he points out that David Bohm was against the term mechanics. He did not like people to use the phrase Bohmian mechanics because it's not mechanics, it's organic, and that it's an active information, which implies, by active information, that implies consciousness. And that's why David Bohm was very interested in Eastern philosophy also. And Basil J. Hiley says he doesn't get into Eastern philosophy, but he admits that he was raised in Burma and India, and so he it's just in his thinking, so to speak. That's just he doesn't have to discuss Eastern philosophy. That's just how he is. He was from a Eastern culture from his youth, so it got hardwired into him, into Basil J. Hiley. And so we have a novel force, a newly discovered force, the quantum potential, that it is anti-gravity and it is non-commutative, and it was practiced by our ancestors going back to the original human culture from 200,000 years ago, as the latest DNA science has proven that the San Bushmen and the Pygmies split in Africa like 200,000 years ago. And so they both rely on noncommutativity as their basis for requiring all the males to do spiritual healing training based on this noncommutativity. And so the problem, as Alon Khan points out again, is that all of science thus far has been based on commutative geometry. And so when what we claim to be technological progress actually has increased the gravitational entropy on Earth, when we consider that all of matter is made of light and that the gravitational mass of light is from non-commutative space-time. And so this non-commutative space-time originates from the non-commutative time frequency in the momentum of light. So you have the wavelength of the photon is directly proportional to the momentum, which is then directly proportional to the frequency that's directly inverse proportional to time. And this is what Louis de Broglie first discovered as the law of phase harmony. When he combined the Planck's constant as energy and frequency with Einstein's relativity energy as the mass times the speed of light squared. And so Basil J. Hiley's big point is that unless you take the h bar, or Planck's constant reduced form, which is the Planck's constant divided by 2 pi, then unless you take that to the order of the limit of Planck's constant squared, and beyond that, then you don't realize the quantum potential as being non-local and non-commutative. And this is what Basil J. Hiley explains with all the equations and that Jack Sarfatti requests that there has to be equations. But in terms of quantum biology, there does not have to be equations, because this is existing on a deeper level of proto-consciousness that's before any kind of symbolic thought. And so that's why Jack Sarfatti says it's vague, and before he dismissed it as New Age, like these non-Western cultures are just New Age. But my argument is exact opposite, that what Jack Sarfatti is claiming is the secret of his anti-gravity warp drive machine or whatever is actually just a continuation of classical physics. And he says it's non-unitary, and you can pump from a classical level, you can pump into the quantum level. And I'm just claiming that that's not accurate, because if you're having the wrong foundation of reality, then you're just going to extend the problems of commutative geometry. And so Basil J. Hiley, he also critiques quantum field theory, because just as Professor Jean Brimon debunks quantum field theory, so in terms of the quantum potential in Bohmian physics, Basil J. Hiley says quantum field theory is wrong, because it's taking a global definition that ignores the particle arising out of the quantum potential that's non-commutative and non-local. And this is Professor John Brimon's big point also, is that Bell's inequality has disproven quantum field theory as a foundation of reality. So the problem with quantum field theory that Jack Sarfatti has been relying on is that they're trying to impose classical physics or onto quantum physics and so they're using classical physics and relativity as their foundation of reality, when Bell's inequality disproved relativity as the foundation of reality, and Einstein was proven wrong. And this is the focus of my own professor in quantum physics, Herbert J. Bernstein. He has pointed out and published on how Einstein was proven wrong by Bell's inequality. So Jack Sarfatti then says, well, physicists, they have quibbles about the foundations. And I said, okay, well, so you disagree about the foundation of reality, but that has consequences. And that's why we have this abrupt global warming crisis today that people don't even know about, but in detail. They don't know the science in detail because it's not focused on, because most of science has a military or corporate focus that's all based on oil, on petrochemicals, and that have caused global warming. But also, as I mentioned to Jack Sarfatti, it was Joseph Fourier in 1824 who first published that the effects of human industry would increase dark heat on Earth. And dark heat is what Fourier was calling infrared radiation, what we now know as infrared radiation. And so this is the increase of actually gravitational entropy on Earth, because of the photons are, being the source of the global warming abrupt crisis and the accelerating crisis, and that the origin of the photons is due to this non-commutative space-time as the secret mass of the photon, as B.G. Siddharth points out. And so that's, like I said, Jack Sarfatti dismisses this as physics, the non-commutativity being vague. But Nobel physicist Brian Josephson, that Jack referred to twice in his talk with me and others, is that Nobel physicist Brian Josephson, he and I have corresponded several times, and he says that Jack does not understand attention, quote unquote. What is attention? And this again is referring to this quantum potential being non-local, and the proto-consciousness being precognitive, and that being the foundation of reality, instead of imposing classical physics onto quantum physics. And I didn't want to point out that Brian Josephson had critiqued Jack in an email to me, because I thought that would have been kind of, I didn't like to say that to Jack's face. He couldn't reply back to Brian Josephson, so that's not really fair to just quote something personal from an email about Jack, to Jack, without Jack's ability to respond to Brian Josephson. But I know he said it recently that Jack and Brian Josephson have been having a debate about relativity. And Brian Josephson has been focused recently on this idea of there being time existing on its own. And physics has not really understood time, because they claim from classical physics that time is just a spatial measurement that's symmetric and invariant. And so this is the deeper foundational problem in physics, is that unless you redefine time as a primitive or primordial time that's non-commutative with frequency, then you miss the whole accurate foundation of reality. So you can have very precise physics, but if it's not accurate, then it just increases gravitational entropy on Earth, causing the ecological crisis that we are experiencing today. And so now Mother Nature is, quote unquote, taking revenge against civilization by causing imminent biological annihilation. That's a phrase that you can search into Google Scholar, and you'll find several academic papers on, quote unquote, biological annihilation being imminent. And so when you have the wrong mathematics as the structure of science, as the language of science, then all the inventions that are mass produced have to rely on the mathematics. And if that math is wrong, then the inventions also are wrong. And this problem has existed due to using the wrong music theory as the foundation of commutative geometry from Platonic philosophy. So then Jack ended his talk saying, well, he felt like Socrates and he was leading his Socratic dialogue. But, he didn't realize that Socrates was promoting commutative geometry. Socrates says that we should get rid of music and meditation and gymnastics and yoga kind of stuff and just focus on irrational magnitude alogon geometry, mathematics. And his claim was then that if anybody trains in this irrational magnitude geometry, then they can become an aristocrat. This was Socrates' claim, and that as Platonic philosophy, it's Plato quoting Socrates. And so then this Platonic philosophy was based on Archytas, the military engineer, and Archytas in turn was relying on Philolaus, who had been a student of Pythagoras, but when he wrote down his claim of Pythagorean philosophy, he wasn't a true Pythagorean. He was never truly initiated. And in order to be a true Pythagorean, you had to practice 5 years of silence in meditation. And instead, what Philolaus wrote down was based on his flipping of the lyre around, his musical instrument, the lyre. And by flipping it around, he then introduced the word magnitude into Western science as a number ratio that then enabled the creation of the first irrational magnitude number and physics from music theory. It was using the wrong music theory that then Newton picked up, and it was proven in the 1960s that Newton was directly inspired by music theory for his theory of gravity as inverse squares. That if he was inspired by the concept of squaring a weight to double the frequency from Archytas in music theory. But when you rely on that concept, you then lose the deeper truth of the non-commutative time frequency. That is the truth of music theory that only Alain Kahn has figured out. I used to call it complementary opposites in this non-commutativity. And I had published in 2006, and I mentioned Alain Kahn in that paper in the non-commutativity. But at that time, I wasn't sure if Alain Kahn was just being metaphorical, because I had discovered his book Triangles of Thought in 2001 when it was first published. I found it new at the university, and he was talking about music theory, and I said, this is the same concept that I had realized on my own, but I wasn't sure if he was being metaphorical. But then his lecture, Music of Shapes, was posted on YouTube, and then I realized, yes, this is the exact precise same secret of music theory. And then he is discussed by a math professor, Michio Durdovich, in Mexico. And Mikio Durdovich then, he points out that the non-commutative music theory of Alain Kahn is actually Pythagorean. In other words, it is pre-Socratic. And this was my inspiration at first when I was a teenager, is that this is the secret of the Logos from the Bible. In the book of John, they say God says he's the Logos, but that concept of Logos is actually Pythagorean. The secret of Pythagorean music theory is the truth of the Logos, and the secret of Pythagorean philosophy is the non-commutativity in terms of modern science. And I'm not going to go into the music theory details because I've done that in other videos, and that's very specific. It's not vague as Jack claims, but it does lead to a certain training of meditation training. That's what it's called Qigong commonly in China. There was a Qigong craze or fever in the 1980s, but they didn't really realize this non-commutative philosophy, because in the 80s in China they were already pretty much westernized, and the Qigong craze was cracked down on. And so this is the argument, is that in terms of Western philosophy, the truth of Qigong is actually non-commutativity. And so then I do have a training manual. That was my first upload to YouTube. And it's free. Anybody can get the training manual. It's on my academia site, or it's just on Doctoroid. It's just called The Idiot's Guide, blah, 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 to enlightenment, Taoist yoga, Qigong, alchemy, Nadon, or whatever, for males. I say for males only, but it's kind of a joke, because since I'm a male, that's what I'm giving that perspective from the male. But in terms of non-commutativity, then the biophysics are the opposite between males and females. And that's our ancestry, is that all the males were required to train in this female energy, that the origin of the universe of reality is actually female, in what in Taoism is called the mystic valley, that's female. but then you have this yin yang. The yang is the light, the consciousness as light, and the spiritual ego. And so that's where you get these battles, these spiritual battles based on the ego. In India, you can look to Ramana Maharshi, who he was actually teaching non-commutativity, but Westerners don't understand that. He was relying on the three gunas as a deeper philosophy for non-dualism. Out of the Tamil culture, which the Tamil culture is the older philosophy in India that originated out of Western Asia, some 6,000, 10,000 years ago when they first went into India. So that's the older philosophy. It's more like Sumerian philosophy. Or it's what they call Dravidian. Dravidian is the Tamil culture of India. So it's the three gunas of no guna, and that's explained by music theory. So like the Rajas is the perfect fifth, and Tamas is the perfect fourth, and Sattva is the octave. And then in terms of Taoism, Yang is Rajas, and Yin is Tamas, and the emptiness in Taoism is the Sattva. And so again, in terms of music theory, the perfect fifth is Yang, the perfect fourth is Yin, and the emptiness is the octave in terms of non-Western Taoist music theory. And then the main practice is called the small universe, which is the 12 notes of the music scale that go along the body. And that gets into cosmology and stuff. So I won't go into all that non-Western ancient science. In India, it's called Kriya Yoga, which is like one of the oldest yoga traditions in India, based on the three gunas. And so you can read Sri Yukteswar's book, the Holy Science, that goes into the details of the three gunas in Kriya Yoga, which uses the same Taoist yoga practice of alchemy. And so if you read in Taoism the book Taoist Yoga, Alchemy and Immortality, that gives the training details. But it really goes all the way back to the San Bushman culture, which is our original human culture. And so there's the radical anthropology tradition that goes into the San Bushman details, along with Professor Brad Keeney. And he was at Minnesota, a psychology professor, and he was hired to study shamanism around the world. And Brad Keeney then focused on the San Bushman healing. That is our original human culture healing tradition from, again, 200,000 years ago. So all this stuff about science and high technology is all very recent, but in terms of biology, we have not changed that much in 200,000 years. And so the vast time of our survival and adaptation on Earth in terms of biology has been based on non-commutativity. And that in rare cases of advanced training, they did achieve antigravity. And that's the secret of antigravity. So it's already been proven, so there's no need to create this new claim that Jack Sarfatti's trying to claim, on paper with his fancy equations in relativity. And Los Alamos is the research, Michael Anderson is leading the research there. And maybe it'll work, but look at what nuclear power and nuclear weapons have done for Earth so far. And you have to ask yourself, well, is that a successful legacy that we can build on? In other words, if we have the wrong foundation of reality, are we just going to make the problem worse than it is already? And what's happening now is that there are 1,200 gigatons of methane, pressurized methane, in the East Siberian Arctic shelf in the Arctic. And this is the world's largest ocean shelf, the East Siberian Arctic shelf. And so as the Arctic Ocean, parts of it is heating up 5 times faster than the rest of the planet. And so that methane is beginning to release and accelerate. Already the methane released out of the East Siberian Arctic shelf is more methane than the rest of the world's oceans put together. And it will continue to accelerate. And that will rapidly double global warming. Global warming will also be doubled when the Arctic ice goes out, and the volume of the ice is already over 70% gone, and it's disappearing very fast due to the ocean temperature increasing very much. And as Jim Massa, the Ph.D. oceanographer, explains in his latest video, the oceans have stratified, and so the mixing zone of the ocean is getting shallower, and due to this stratification and the heating up of the ocean, then you have more heat now being released from the ocean, and the oceans have stored over about 500 zettajoules of heat already, whereas the atmospheric warming thus far from abrupt global warming has been about only 30 zettajoules. So you can see how 500 zettajoules of heat thus far is way bigger than 30 zettajoules, and all that heat will be released into the atmosphere, and increasingly so because the oceans are now stratified, and so the mixing does not occur, and then the heat is forced to then start releasing from the surface of the earth. And this is what Jim Massa, the oceanographer, predicted would happen, and thus the oceans are what is really driving abrupt global warming, because that's the battery that has stored up the abrupt global warming heat, and over 90% of the heat from global warming has been absorbed into the oceans, and so now it's being released back out. And that's why the carbon cycle on Earth is actually a 10,000 year cycle. But since the CO2 emission rate has been 100 times faster than the background rate, therefore the oceans have stored so much so fast that the oceans will be releasing it much faster, along with the methane. And so this is Mother Nature's way of taking revenge against the past 1,000 or 2,000 years of human civilization, or even 10,000 years since we first developed agriculture around the world after the Holocene ended of the Milankovitch cycles. And so it's been quite a fascinating ride in terms of the species, the human species, and what it's done to the rest of life on Earth, and what it's claiming to be progress in technology. And Jack Sarfatti is claiming that only his theoretical physics equations will save Earth. And I say congratulations to Jack, and good luck for Michael Anderson with working on Jack's research. And my claim is that they're wrong, and that we should rely on what's already worked in the past, and that this is the true foundation of reality, even though it goes against all of civilization thus far in the modern sense of the word of the past 10,000 years. Thank you very much.